One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers. But they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but, for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts. And then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications. And the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside. But as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before. Like, this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before. And so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away. And she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And 2, again, this is so good. Why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, this is so good. What's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No, this is the one. This is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You got to see it through. It's too good not to." And so, at Tabby's insistence, That's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance, which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story that Tabby saved from the trash can would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. On the evening of Wednesday, September 9th, 2009, 20-year-old Shelley Nance walked into her bedroom inside of her off-campus apartment in Dallas, Texas, and then shut the door behind her. Shelley liked the fact that once inside of her room, she would not need to speak to anybody. She preferred it that way. She settled down on her bed with her back propped against a stack of pillows, and then she took out her notebook and pencil and began to draw. Shelley spent most of her time drawing on a computer at the Art Institute of Dallas, where she was a second-year multimedia and animation student. But when she was by herself and just wanted to relax, she preferred just using pencil and paper. Tonight, Shelley began sketching a young woman who looked a lot like herself, slender with long flowing hair, and just the hint of a smile on her face. Shelley originally began drawing to escape the boredom of growing up in the tiny town of Italy, Texas, where she'd always been something of a loner. She even joked about that in her senior yearbook, choosing a biting quote to go with her picture. She wrote, "You laugh at me because I'm different. I laugh at you because you're all the same." But Shelley got so good at drawing that it actually changed her life. She eventually won an art competition that gave her a partial scholarship to this art institute, and suddenly, Shelley had a plan for life after high school, to be an artist. As soon as she got to the art school and started meeting her eccentric and creative classmates, Shelley felt like she'd finally found her place. For the first time ever, she had friends who actually understood and accepted her quirks. They would go to anime conventions together and even dress up as their favorite anime characters. It was a world that Shelley frankly never could have imagined back in her hometown, which was basically no more than a truck stop along a highway. And going to this art institute provided another big first for Shelley. She had a boyfriend, Nathan Shuck, and they often could be found playing video games together on the couch at his apartment. But as Shelley sat there sketching tiny doves into her picture, she realized that having this active social life now could actually be kind of a burden. Until recently, she had never had to consider anybody else's feelings but her own, but now having a boyfriend meant she had to plan for two people. And after dating Nathan for 2 months now, she was actually starting to have her doubts about the relationship. She thought Nathan was a good person, but deep down, she knew she didn't feel about him the way he felt about her. Now, she didn't want to hurt his feelings, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel really strongly that she kind of just wanted to break up with him. She just had no idea how to actually tell him. Shelley put her pencil down and closed her sketch pad, hoping for a new distraction, and she found one after she hopped on her computer and went on a popular website looking at other artists' work. And Shelley's thoughts very quickly kind of drifted away from Nathan and the seemingly imminent, unpleasant conversation that she was going to have with him. After a while, Shelley looked up at the clock, and she was shocked to see that it was already 6 a.m. She'd been up all night. She really needed to get some rest before her classes that afternoon. So she left her room to make sure the front door was locked, then she went back to her bedroom, closed the door, crawled back into bed, and drifted off to sleep. One late night in the summer of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Fred stood inside of a loud casino in Las Vegas, feeling incredibly nervous. He knew what he was about to do was a horrible idea. In fact, he didn't even know if he had the guts to try it. Fred grabbed a huge wad of cash out of his pocket, and as he looked at it, he he thought about the reason he was here. So Fred had actually flown to Las Vegas on a whim after a bad meeting with a group of investors. So Fred had founded this small company 3 years earlier, and he really needed a loan from these investors, but they had said no. Fred had actually already lost over $13 million to this point, and so the investors said, look, like your track record is not good enough. We're not giving you any more money. And this was a huge problem for Fred, because right now, in all of his company accounts, he had a total of $5,000. And at a minimum, he needed to pay his fuel bill for his company, which was $24,000. And that bill was due soon, so he didn't have enough money to cover it. And besides the fuel bill, he also didn't have any money to make payroll. So basically, Fred did not have any more money. And if he didn't find a way to find more money, he would have to file for bankruptcy, shut his business down, and lay off all of his employees. And so Fred really couldn't think of a worse fate here. He totally believed in this company. I mean, this was his baby. He'd invested all of his inheritance into it. But now it was about to collapse, unless he got really, really lucky. All around him in the casino, Fred could see gamblers hunched over slot machines and over poker tables and blackjack tables, and some people looked elated, like they were having the time of their lives. And many other people looked like they were maybe having the worst time of their lives and were on the brink of tears. Fred didn't know if he'd be celebrating or sobbing by the end of this night. All he knew is he was out of options here. He could either do nothing and just kind of accept his fate, that his business was doomed and would have to be shut down, or he could do what he was doing tonight, which was to basically take what little cash he had and put it on a game of chance, basically gambled the money he had in hopes of winning enough money to keep his business going a little bit longer. And so after taking a calming breath, Fred began walking over to a blackjack table because someone had told him that of all the games you could play in a Las Vegas casino, the game with the best odds was blackjack. Fred chose a table with an open seat. He exchanged all his cash for chips while he prayed that he was making the right choice here. And then Fred began to play. For the first few hands, Fred was pretty cautious, only placing small bets. But he won all those small bets, and it kind of emboldened him. And so he began placing larger bets. And he began winning those bets too. And in fact, it got to the point where he was winning so consistently that a crowd of strangers had formed behind the table just to watch Fred. But Fred wasn't even aware of the crowd behind him. He was so focused on every single hand. I mean, for him, this was like his life he was gambling with. And eventually he got to a place where he had like a mountain of chips in front of him, and he was gambling huge sums of it all at once. And then eventually, when he had this big mountain of chips in front of him, Fred decided this was it. He was going to double down and go all in. And so he puts all these chips out and he waits, and eventually the dealer flips over their cards. And as soon as they did, the crowd around Fred, who we hadn't even noticed to this point, erupted in cheers because Fred had just won. And when the dealer pushed all the chips back over to him and he got to count how much money he had, he realized he had started with $5,000, but now had $27,000. He had gambled and won. $27,000 was just enough to pay that fuel bill and keep his company running a little bit longer. So basically exactly what Fred had hoped for had happened. And then during this extra time that Fred had basically won himself, he was able to secure $11 million in investor funding, which was enough money to finally scale up this small business into the behemoth that we know it as today. Fred went from being a guy betting his last chips at a casino to now being a multi-billionaire. Fred's full name is Fred Smith, and that little company that he scaled up on a gamble was FedEx. One evening in the late 1980s, a man in his 20s named Norm walked into a house party in the Hollywood Hills, which is a very exclusive and pricey neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. In this house, which was filled with people, there were all these actors and entertainers and Hollywood-type people, and Norm, who was this kind of scruffy guy with long stringy hair and who had no experience in the entertainment industry, knew he did not fit in here at all. In fact, Norm never would have been at a party like this if not for what had happened to him just a few hours earlier. So that afternoon, Norm had gotten into a fight with his boss at the motorcycle shop where he worked. Now, Norm and his boss never got along, but they managed to coexist for the most part, Except today, this small argument had turned into a huge argument that turned into Norm getting fired. And so after getting fired, Norm left the shop and just began aimlessly walking around Los Angeles until he wound up running into one of his friends. And over the course of this conversation where Norm's like, yeah, I got fired, not doing too good, the friend was like, oh, well, tonight there's going to be this big party up in the Hollywood Hills. Why don't you come along? And Norm, who was feeling admittedly pretty down after being fired, decided, what the heck? I'll go to this party because maybe that will boost my spirits. And so now here he was. And so Norm went and found his friend in the house party. And for a little while, the party was pretty great. I mean, Norm felt kind of uncomfortable, didn't really know anybody. It was kind of awkward, but it was fine. Him and his friend were drinking and chatting, and his friend was introducing him to some people, and it was all good. Except Norm just couldn't shake the anger he felt about getting fired. Not only at the fact that he was now unemployed, which was a huge problem, but he also just felt mad at his boss. Like, how dare his boss do this to him? And so to cope with this, Norm just began drinking really heavily, like way more than anybody else at this party. And before long, Norm was completely plastered drunk. But it would turn out getting totally smashed did not calm Norm down. In fact, if anything, it only made him more blind with rage about what had happened to him. And so naturally what he did is he departs his friend and pushes through the crowd of people, and he goes up to the second floor where there was this balcony that overlooked where basically everybody in the house was. And Norm, who's slurring his speech and he's totally a mess, he screams out to the crowd of these people that he doesn't even know, these Hollywood people, basically screams at them to stop what they're doing and listen to him. And everyone did. They turned around and looked up at this guy like, what's going on here? And Norm just begins delivering this totally angry rant that kind of didn't even make any sense. I mean, he's drunk, but he's basically ranting about how mad he is and this horrible injustice that's been done to him, and just on and on. He's just pouring out all of his emotions, and everybody's just kind of looking at him like, what is going on here? It was like a train wreck, They couldn't look away. Eventually, Norman finished up his big, rambling, humiliating speech, and he stepped away from the railing, and everybody down below who, had been wrapped to this point, but now was kind of like, whatever. They went back to the party, and Norm just stood up there kind of taking in the scene, and suddenly he felt a tap on his shoulder. And he turned around and he saw there was this person he didn't recognize, and this person says to Norm, hey, have you ever considered acting in a play? It would turn out that person was a Hollywood producer, and they were putting on a play in LA. And they really liked Norm's look, the whole kind of scruffy vibe, but even more as they watched him deliver that totally angry, drunken rant that he managed to get all these people to listen to, that it was obvious he had natural charisma and he could command an audience even when the audience had no idea what he was talking about. And so ultimately, this producer literally offered Norm an acting job, and Norm, who really didn't have aspirations to be an actor, but now needed a job because he had just been fired that day, he's unemployed, he agreed. He said, okay, I'll act in your play. And so Norman would act in this play, and he would do such a good job, despite the fact that he totally was not an actor. He literally was a drunk guy at a party who randomly got recognized by some producer. But regardless, he acts in this play, and he is such a natural and does such a good job that he gets noticed by other Hollywood producers and casting directors. And before long, he lands his starring role in the mega hit TV show, The Walking Dead. Norm's full name is Norman Reedus. A little more than 24 hours later, at 7 a.m. on Friday, September 11th, Shelley's mother, Cynthia, woke up in a motel in Colorado. She and her husband were a little over halfway through their 22-hour drive to Yellowstone National Park, which was like their dream trip. While they raised their 3 girls, they barely ever left their small town in Texas. But now that Shelley, their youngest, was settled in college, they'd finally decided to take the plunge and go do this big trip. When they'd hit the road Thursday morning, Cynthia sent a text message to all 3 of the girls, and Shelley was the only one who didn't text back. But Cynthia was not that worried about it, because Shelley was a night owl and she often slept during the day when everybody else was up and about. But Shelley would usually call at some point after she woke up for class, except this time she didn't. And so Cynthia had called one of Shelley's sisters to say she was worried, but the sister thought their mother was just overreacting. And so she told her mom, hey, remember, she's an adult. She's a 20-year-old woman who's allowed to have a social life. In fact, her sister was happy that maybe Shelley the homebody was out somewhere having fun for once. At 9 a.m. that same morning, Cynthia and her husband went for a scenic ride through the Colorado Rockies. But Cynthia barely noticed any of it, because she still hadn't heard from Shelley, and she just had this gut feeling that something was actually wrong. And so as they drove through this beautiful area, Cynthia grabbed her phone and called Shelley's school. A school administrator answered the call, but she sounded annoyed at Cynthia's request. She said they just didn't have the resources to send somebody out to check on every student who didn't call their parents right on time. Cynthia knew she was coming off like an overprotective mother, but she also knew it was completely unlike Shelley to ignore her messages for this long. So Cynthia practically begged the administrator to please check later that day and just see if her daughter made it to class. The administrator sighed and said she'd wait for a break between classes and see if someone could track Shelley down. Around noon that day, Shelley's roommate, Ashley Alvera, grumpily made her way up the stairs towards their apartment. Someone from the school administration had stopped Ashley when she was leaving class and asked her to just stop what she was doing and go back to her apartment and check on her roommate, Shelley, make sure she's okay. Apparently, Shelley's parents were looking for her, and she wasn't returning any calls or texts. But Ashley thought this request was totally ridiculous. Shelley's parents did not need to know where Shelley was 24/7. She was an adult. And so now Ashley felt like her time was being wasted. But nonetheless, she made it upstairs to the apartment, she unlocked the door, and walked inside. And once she was inside the apartment, she noticed the door to Shelley's bedroom was closed, as usual, and so she walked over and knocked, and she didn't get an answer. Then she called out Shelley's name, but she was met with more silence, so Ashley opened the door. And there in bed was Shelley, lying face down under the blanket. And so Ashley quickly went from feeling annoyed at this to now just feeling angry. She'd come all the way back to the apartment to check on her roommate just to find out Shelley had been sleeping all day. So Ashley walked over and kind of gruffly told Shelley, hey, wake up, your parents are looking for you. But Shelley didn't move. Ashley sighed and walked back over to the door and flipped on the light in the room, but when the lights were now on, Shelley didn't react. And so now, feeling sort of on edge, Ashley walked back over to the bed and gently shook Shelley, but Shelley didn't move. And also, Shelley's arm felt cold to the touch. And that's when Ashley just grabbed the blanket and pulled it back, and she saw Shelley's sheets were soaked in blood. Absolutely horrified, Ashley screamed Shelley's name over and over again, but Shelley wasn't moving or making any sound, and so Ashley turned and ran out of the room to call 911. Not long after that 911 call, the school called Cynthia back and began to tell her what was going on. They told her her daughter had been found in her room, she was covered in blood, and then before the caller from the school could explain further, Cynthia's cell phone just went dead. The reception in the Colorado mountains where they were was terrible, and so she had just dropped service. And so Cynthia, who's heard this terrible thing about her daughter, began frantically trying to call back, but she just couldn't get any service. And so Cynthia shouted at her husband to turn the car around and keep driving until she got better phone reception. Her husband immediately did a U-turn and hit the gas, making the tires squeal, and then just as suddenly as Cynthia had lost service, she suddenly had service again. And so she screamed at her husband to stop the car so she could call them back. And so Cynthia, whose hand was now shaking, finally got through to the Art Institute and breathlessly asked them if her daughter was okay. And the woman on the other end said she was so sorry, but Shelley was dead. Police were investigating right now, but it appeared her daughter had been murdered. Cynthia and her husband just sat there in silence in the middle of nowhere, absorbing the worst news a parent can possibly receive. Cynthia felt this desperate urge to do something, visit Shelley's apartment, talk to detectives, or just be there to comfort their other daughters. But they had no choice but to just start driving again because it was going to take them nearly a day to drive all the way back to Texas. At about the same time that Cynthia and her husband got this terrible news, Detective Paul Elzie placed a fan belt and motor oil on the checkout counter at a Dallas auto shop. He was heading out to his farm in East Texas that weekend and was looking forward to doing some maintenance on his tractor. And just as he finished paying, his phone rang. It was his partner. His partner said they had a murder to solve, and it was a tough one. A young art student had been stabbed to death in her bed with no witnesses, and so far, no evidence. Suddenly, Elsie knew he was not going to be spending time at his farm. So he left the auto shop, got into his car, and drove across town to Shelley's apartment complex. Elsie walked up the stairs to Shelley's apartment and stepped inside. And already it was flooded with evidence technicians who were dusting for fingerprints and snapping photos. Elsie's partner greeted him and quickly got him up to speed. The victim's roommate discovered the body around noon, but she said she didn't know anything else because she'd been away at class all morning. Unfortunately, the technicians had not found anything useful so far. No fingerprints, shoe prints, or hairs near the body that could give police some clues to who the killer was. Detective Elsie thanked his partner for the update and said he wanted to take his own look around the small apartment to see if anything stood out. Elsie was a seasoned homicide detective with 36 years on the force. He saw each case as a challenge, a puzzle he would need to solve, and sometimes the pieces did just kind of fall into place. Inside the apartment, he noticed the TV and some other fairly expensive electronic equipment were still there. Also, the windows weren't broken, and there didn't appear to be any signs of forced entry, so this didn't seem like a robbery. More likely, Elsie thought, the victim let the killer into their apartment, or the killer had a key. Elsie walked into the bathroom next to Shelley's bedroom and realized why there was so little blood tracked around the apartment. He could see a spot of blood on the edge of the sink, as well as a few spots on the edge of the tub. The killer had clearly tried to clean themselves up after committing the murder, and so whoever killed Shelley had thought this crime through and potentially had really thought through how to get away with it. Elsie then headed to the bedroom to look at the victim. Shelley was lying on her stomach on the bed in a shirt and underwear. Her back and neck were covered in wounds, and her long reddish-brown hair was now matted with dried blood. Elsie had seen countless bodies over his long career, and he usually kept a very cool professional distance from the victims' lives, but he was not prepared for what lay before him now. The murder was gruesome, but that wasn't what unsettled him. It was Shelley herself. She was the same age as one of Elsie's daughters, and he suddenly felt like he was looking at his own child lying there, covered in blood. Elsie composed himself and leaned over the bed and looked more closely at the condition of Shelley's body. He couldn't even count the number of stab wounds in her neck and back, but there didn't seem to be wounds anywhere else, including her hands and arms. The lack of defensive wounds made Elsie think that Shelley had not put up much of a fight against her attacker. Plus, all the blood seemed to be concentrated on the bed, while the rest of the bedroom looked basically undisturbed, as though Shelley never had a chance to get up. So maybe she was asleep when this happened. Shelley's clothes were still on and relatively undisturbed, making Elsie think she had not been sexually assaulted as well. But looking at her battered body, Elsie saw a killer that must have been filled with rage, and this rage-filled killer clearly had ready access to this apartment. And so the detective felt certain that Shelley must have been killed by someone she knew who must have had a very personal and serious problem with her. Later on that day, sometime in the afternoon, the medical examiner provided a more detailed picture of what actually killed Shelley. Both her carotid artery and her jugular vein, which are in her neck, were severed, and her esophagus and trachea had been punctured, as well as one of her lungs. And so Shelley had suffered multiple wounds that on their own would have killed her, but she had several of these fatal wounds. Yet beyond the savage attack on Shelley's upper body, there were basically no other injuries. Not only were there no additional stab wounds, the medical examiner also concluded that Shelley had not been sexually assaulted. And the killer left behind almost no obvious physical clues, except perhaps one. As the medical examiner was swabbing under Shelley's fingernails in hopes that maybe she might have scratched her killer, he spotted a blue speck under Shelley's left wrist. It looked like nothing more than a tiny piece of plastic, but it was the only physical evidence the killer seemed to have left behind. So he had sent it off to the lab to be tested. Detective Elsie was interviewing Shelley's roommate, Ashley, at the police station when he heard a knock at the door, and one of the officers handed him the autopsy results. Elsie stepped into the hallway outside of the interview room and quickly scanned over the report for highlights, and one finding jumped off the page at him. From the condition of Shelley's body, the medical examiner estimated that she had been dead for up to 24 hours by the time Ashley found her. Elsie was startled. He had assumed that Shelley must have been killed no more than a few hours before Ashley found her, But now the medical examiner was saying that the murder most likely happened a full day earlier, sometime on Thursday, not Friday. And this cast the murder into a whole new light. And so LZ went back into the interview room with lots of new questions for Ashley. It dawned on LZ that if Ashley's story was to be believed, that meant Ashley had been living with the corpse of a roommate for the better part of a full day. Ashley had said that she and Shelley were really never friends, they were just roommates, and it wasn't uncommon for them to go days without seeing each other. In fact, Ashley had already told LZ that the last time she had seen Shelley was Wednesday morning before she'd left for class, so 48 hours before Shelley had been found. But despite that, LZ really just wanted to know where Ashley was all day on Thursday when she apparently didn't see her roommate at all. Ashley told him she'd left for class at 9 a.m. that day and then come back to the apartment at 3 p.m. And for the rest of the day, Ashley said she stayed at the apartment, eating dinner, doing homework, and then going to bed. LZ's eyebrows shot up, and he held up the autopsy results. And then he told Ashley that the report showed her roommate had been killed earlier than police realized initially. He told her that if what she was saying was true, she'd gone about her business in their small apartment for 18 hours with a dead body in the next room. How was that possible? But Ashley only seemed confused, like she couldn't quite process the information she had just been given. She said she really didn't know what he was talking about, but the detective thought that just wasn't good enough. LZ pointed out that the roommates shared a single bathroom, and that investigators found blood on the sink and in the bathtub. How could Ashley possibly have missed the blood? Didn't it make her worry about her roommate? At that point, Ashley began to cry. She did see the blood, but it was only a few spots, so she didn't think Shelley was hurt in any serious way. But still, LZ was not persuaded. He thought there was more going on here than Ashley was saying. So he asked her, was there any problem between them? Ashley insisted that they'd only had minor disagreements, just girl stuff, she said. The detective wondered what that meant exactly, and so he said, were they fighting over the same love interest or something? But Ashley swore that never happened. Shelley had a boyfriend, Nathan, and Ashley was not interested in him at all. In fact, Ashley said she had very little contact with Nathan, and she kind of liked it that way. Friends of hers told her that Nathan actually had a really bad temper. He apparently loved playing video games so much that if something went bad for him in the game, he would just totally lose his cool and explode. Detective LZ thought Ashley's answers still seemed off. In fact, they were so far off that LZ started to see Ashley as a suspect. After all, who would have had easier access to the apartment than Shelley's own roommate? But LZ decided to try a new tactic, and he asked Ashley, was there anybody else besides her who had a key to this apartment? And Ashley told him that besides her and Shelley, no one else did. At this point, Detective LZ couldn't help but feel convinced that Ashley must have had something to do with Shelley's death. If Ashley had the only other key, well, then she was either directly responsible, or perhaps she was the one who let the killer into the apartment. He didn't know which it was, but based on how nervous Ashley looked at this moment, he had a pretty good idea how to find out. So he just came out and accused Ashley outright of the murder. He told her to confess, and that things would actually be much easier for her if she did. But Ashley just stared back at the detective in total disbelief and began to cry again. For the next couple of hours, Detective LZ tried to wear Ashley down, hoping for a confession that would wrap up the case. But Ashley did not change her story, and she never confessed to anything. By Saturday, September 12th, after an excruciating, mentally torturous journey, Shelley's parents finally arrived back in Texas and went to meet with Detective LZ. When they came into the station, LZ thought they looked like they hadn't slept the entire drive back, and he knew they were obviously grieving. But he did need to talk to them right now regardless of their condition. Their answers could be the key to finding out who killed their daughter. And so the first question he asked them was, were there any problems between Shelley and her roommate Ashley that they were aware of? Her parents seemed surprised by the question. They said their daughter and her roommate Ashley weren't exactly good friends, but they certainly didn't have any major problems that they knew of. LZ followed up by asking if they could think of anyone who might want to hurt Shelley. Did she have any enemies? But her parents said that Shelley had always been a bit of a homebody who kept to herself, and because she didn't really go out much, there wasn't any drama in her life and very little opportunity to make enemies. Cynthia said that of their 3 daughters, Shelley was the easiest to raise. She never drank alcohol or did drugs, stayed out late, or got into trouble. After that, Detective Elsie asked them what Shelley's boyfriend, Nathan, was like. Shelley's mom said they'd never met him since they'd only been dating for a couple of months. The only thing Shelley had said about Nathan was that her dad probably wouldn't like him, but it was just because he had a lip piercing and tattoos. However, Cynthia did tell the detective that a couple of weeks ago, Shelley had called her to ask how to break up with her boyfriend, Nathan. Cynthia had given her some advice, but after that, she had no idea if Shelley actually had broken up with him or not. Now, Elsie needed to know whether Shelley had followed through and ended that relationship with Nathan. If the guy had a hot temper, as Shelley's roommate claimed, a bad breakup, in theory, could be enough to send him into a rage. Later that day, when Elsie walked into the interrogation room to speak to Nathan for the first time, he was surprised to see Nathan's appearance. Even though he had tattoos and a piercing, he was really just kind of a skinny kid. And the way he was sitting in the chair seemed so childlike. He had pulled his feet up onto the seat and was kind of clutching his knees close to his chest the way a child would. But Elsie knew looks could be deceiving, so right away he asked where Nathan had been on Thursday, the day of Shelley's murder. Nathan said he'd been staying at his mother's house that week, and he had slept there on Wednesday night. On Thursday morning, his mother had dropped him off at the school at around 9 a.m., but he didn't have school until 3. The detective couldn't believe what Nathan had just told him. He had just admitted that he had this big window of time on the day Shelley was murdered that was basically unaccounted for. Nathan told the detective that all he had done that day was homework in the computer lab during the 6 hours before his 3 p.m. class, but Elsie was sure that Nathan had left at some point for some amount of time, maybe to go to the bathroom or maybe to get something to eat, something. He just felt like 6 hours sitting in the same spot doing homework nonstop sounded sort of unlikely for even the most diligent of students. But Elsie kept that to himself and just asked Nathan if he had a key to Shelley's apartment. But Nathan said he didn't. Elsie asked him why not. If Nathan was her boyfriend, wouldn't Shelley give him a key? But Nathan said they'd only been dating a couple of months, and really their relationship was not that serious. They hadn't had sex. In fact, they hadn't even kissed. He told the detective the only thing they'd ever done that was sort of intimate was hold hands. Elsie was convinced that Nathan had to be downplaying his relationship with Shelley to kind of make himself seem less culpable. I mean, after all, what college couple didn't do anything more than hold hands if they've been dating for a couple of months? I mean, it just seemed kind of unrealistic. But Nathan swore that really was the truth, and he insisted that holding hands was actually a really big deal for both of them. At this point, the detective realized he was likely dealing with a very sheltered and somewhat awkward kid. But he also knew about Nathan's reputation for having a really bad temper, and so maybe he could get Nathan to show it by catching him off guard. So the detective directly confronted him. He asked Nathan how he felt when Shelley broke up with him. Was he angry? Did he lose control? Is that what happened? But Nathan didn't seem angry at all. He seemed confused. He said he didn't know what the detective was talking about because Shelley had not broken up with him. Elsie told Nathan he was lying. He knew from Shelley's mother that Shelley definitely wanted to break up with him, and he told Nathan his new theory. Shelley must have ended their relationship, and Nathan had been so upset he had flown into a rage and killed Shelley. But to Elsie's surprise, instead of protesting his innocence, Nathan barely reacted. He just sat there staring. Elsie asked him, "What are you thinking about?" And Nathan just said he felt sort of numb, that he didn't know how to react, that this felt like a bad dream he was just hoping to wake up from. Following a hunch, Elsie then asked Nathan to lift up his shirt. Nathan did what he was told and stood and lifted it up, and the detective could see visible scratches on his chest. Elsie immediately wondered if maybe he got those scratches from Shelley as she tried to fight off her attacker, maybe at first, because he knew she didn't put up much of a fight, but maybe she put up a little bit of a fight and that was it. But Nathan said no, he got those scratches actually from scratching himself. He said he didn't kill his girlfriend and he really had nothing to hide. At this point, Elsie saw an opening. If that was true, that Nathan had nothing to hide, would he let detectives search his apartment right now? Nathan said, yeah, go ahead. They wouldn't find anything. And so, a little while later that day, Elsie and some other investigators followed Nathan up the steps to his off-campus apartment. When they got to the door, Nathan unlocked it and let them inside. Elsie told Nathan to wait by the front door, and he had a detective stay with him. Elsie didn't want Nathan to interfere. When Elsie got inside the apartment, the first thing he noticed was the apartment was incredibly clean. He'd been inside a fair number of college apartments, and typically they were a mess. He turned to Nathan and asked him, why is this place so immaculate? Had he cleaned it up recently, hoping to hide evidence? But Nathan said that he had nothing to do with how the apartment looked. His roommate was a total neat freak who couldn't bear the sight of dirty dishes or things lying around the house. Nathan said his roommate even cleaned up after him. Elsie nodded and then asked which room was Nathan's. Nathan raised a hand and pointed him in the right direction. The detective went inside the bedroom, and within minutes, he made a troubling discovery. Nathan stored weapons underneath his bed. The detective found throwing stars and swords, but most disturbingly were all the knives. Boxes and boxes of knives. Elsie felt sure he would find the murder weapon among all these blades, so he bagged up each knife individually to be tested for blood. After that, Elsie left the bedroom and confronted Nathan again. He asked if Nathan had a fascination with violence, but Nathan said it really wasn't like that. He just liked to collect weapons that he thought were cool. Elsie didn't know what to make of that, but he was not convinced. Next, Elsie went to Nathan's bathroom, which, unlike the rest of the apartment, was a total mess. The counter was covered with containers of deodorant, hair gel, and shaving cream. There was stuff everywhere. But tucked in amongst the chaos was something very odd, even chilling. It was a clear sandwich bag with what appeared to be long reddish-brown hair inside, hair that was the same color as Shelley's. But that wasn't all. There was also what appeared to be drops of blood inside the bag as well. Carefully, with a gloved hand, Elsie lifted the bag up and then went to Nathan and held the bag out in front of him, demanding to know what he was doing with it. But Nathan, whose face now went white, swore he'd never seen it before in his life. He didn't even know what it was, and after all, who would collect a random sandwich bag of hair and blood? It made no sense. And then something shifted in Nathan's mind, and he said he wanted a lawyer before he answered any more questions, and he asked the investigators to please get out of his apartment. Since the detectives didn't have a search warrant, and they were there only as Nathan's guest, legally they had no choice but to leave. But they could keep everything they'd already found, and Elsie was very confident that one of the knives, and also that baggie, would come back positive for Shelley's blood. On Friday, September 18th, so a week after Shelley's body had been discovered, the school held a memorial service for her. When Shelley's parents got there, they were touched to see that Shelley's beautiful art was on display. Shelley's mother, Cynthia, was also moved by just how many people had come out to celebrate Shelley. She never thought her quiet, introverted daughter would have such a large group of friends. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, that Shelley had meant something to so many people. Then, a young man with a lip piercing and tattoos approached Cynthia. He introduced himself as Nathan, Shelley's boyfriend. He told her he wasn't sure if he should be speaking to her, but he just wanted her to know how sorry he was that Shelley had died, and then he held out his hand for her to shake it. But Shelley's mother couldn't do it. She had seen the look on Detective Elsie's face after she had mentioned the breakup, and she knew exactly what the detective was thinking, that Shelley's boyfriend, Nathan, had murdered Shelley. And now, with Nathan standing right in front of her, Cynthia couldn't help but feel repulsed, and so she did not shake his hand, and so Nathan just stood there awkwardly for a second, and then Nathan got the hint, lowered his hand, and walked away. By the end of September, the analysis of the knives and the baggie that were taken from Nathan's apartment came back from the lab. The first result shocked Elsie. None of the knives in Nathan's apartment had any traces of blood, Shelley's or anybody else's. However, that little baggie containing the hair inside of Nathan's bathroom did have blood in it, and it belonged to Shelley. And so Elsie assumed, after Nathan killed his girlfriend, he must have taken that as sort of like a trophy from the murder scene to add to his bizarre collection. So, on October 8th, 2009, almost a month after Shelley was murdered, Detective Elsie called Nathan to the police station for a second interview. But this time, Nathan showed up with his lawyer. And the lawyer, who spoke on behalf of Nathan, said that Nathan was happy to answer the officer's questions and wanted to do whatever he could to help catch Shelley's killer. But the lawyer hoped that this conversation would be civil. Elsie knew what that meant. He would have to keep a lid on how aggressively he questioned Nathan, or potentially they would just leave. And so Elsie nodded and then told Nathan that the bag they'd found in his bathroom contained his girlfriend's hair and blood. And so he asked Nathan to please explain how it got there. Nathan's lawyer looked down at Nathan and nodded, letting him know it was okay to answer this question. Nathan took a deep breath and then looked at Elsie and told him he had never seen that baggie before. He swore it. But he argued that that really shouldn't be that surprising. After all, he was not the only person who lived in that apartment. And his roommate, whose name was Daniel Willem, did have easy access to the bathroom. And Nathan didn't stop there. He claimed that his roommate, Daniel, was jealous of his relationship with Shelley because Daniel actually had a crush on Nathan. In fact, Nathan said Daniel had gotten really possessive of him and wanted to control him. Elsie asked Nathan if his roommate, Daniel, had ever made a legitimate pass at Nathan, like really tried to be romantically involved with him, and Nathan said no, he had not. And so even though Elsie didn't know what to make of this, he suspected that maybe this crush that he was talking about was not real, and perhaps Nathan was just throwing his roommate under the bus to protect himself. Elsie turned to the lawyer and said that things didn't look good for his client. The investigators had found Shelley's blood in his bathroom, and he said that Nathan had a motive to hurt Shelley because he knew that she planned to break up with him. Plus, Nathan had a reputation for having an explosive temper. And so, if Nathan confessed right now to what he did, maybe the prosecutor would be lenient with him. At this point, the lawyer stood up and said the interview was over, and then he led Nathan out of the room. At this point, Elsie felt sure that Nathan really was just raising suspicions about his roommate simply to protect himself. But the detective had been around long enough to know that he would need to speak with Daniel as well, because it was true he did have access to that bathroom where that baggie was found. So, a couple of days later, Elsie got in touch with Daniel and asked him to come to the police station to answer a few questions. And once Daniel was there, Elsie decided not to ask him about his supposed crush on Nathan right away. Instead, Elsie asked Daniel where he was the morning of Shelley's murder, and Daniel described his busy day. Daniel said he went to Starbucks to grab a coffee, and then after that, he drove to the lake to take some photographs for school, and then he went to Walmart to pick up some soap and hair dye, and then after that, he'd gone to a friend's apartment to work on an assignment. However, that friend wasn't home. Elsie's ears perked up. Daniel's alibi was not any better than Nathan's. Daniel had said when he took photos at the lake, he was alone, and since the friend that he had gone to study with wasn't home, there was no one to corroborate that part of his story either. So then at this point, Elsie asked Daniel if he had romantic feelings for Nathan, and Daniel said absolutely not. Then Elsie told him that Nathan had said that Daniel was very controlling about their relationship, and he asked Daniel if that was true. And Daniel said something surprising. He said that yes, he actually was pretty controlling, but he was only doing it because he was concerned for Nathan. Daniel said that Nathan was stalking Shelley. He was following her around all the time to the point where he was ignoring his own classes and his grades were dropping. Daniel said he was actually trying to get Nathan away from Shelley. This surprised Elsie. Now, both roommates were basically suggesting that the other could have killed Shelley. And if it was true that Nathan really was stalking Shelley, well, Elsie already felt like he was the most likely suspect, and that sort of fit. At this point, Elsie asked Daniel about that little bag that contained the hair and blood inside of Nathan's bathroom. And Daniel told him he had no idea how that got there. Now, of course, if Daniel did do it, obviously he would say he didn't know where it came from. This is what Elsie was thinking. The bag with Shelley's blood and hair was easily the most damning piece of evidence they had, and both roommates claimed they knew nothing about it. So Elsie used the same tactic he had tried with Ashley and with Nathan. He flat out accused Daniel of the murder, hoping his tough cop routine would intimidate him and get him to come out and confess. But when he accused Daniel of the murder, just like Ashley and Nathan before him, Daniel swore up and down it really was not him. Elsie tried pressing him again and again, but just like Ashley and Nathan, Daniel said, "Really, I had nothing to do with this." After Daniel left the station, Detective Elsie stayed in the interview room for a few minutes, thinking about everything he had just learned. He had 3 likely suspects. There was Ashley, who apparently was just in the apartment going about her business with her roommate's dead body for 18 hours. There was Nathan, who Shelley wanted to break up with and apparently who had a very bad temper. And finally, there was Daniel, who may have seen Shelley as a romantic rival if Daniel really did have a crush on Nathan. But all 3 of these suspects totally insisted they had nothing to do with the crime. And so Elsie felt like one of them had to be lying. He just needed to figure out who. So Elsie and his team started digging deeper into each of their suspects' alibis. Elsie found himself staring at computer screens, surveillance tapes, and phone messages for days on end. But after so many hours, when he felt like he could barely keep his eyes open anymore, something on one of those screens finally jumped out at him. Elsie was staring at a brand new piece of evidence, and it pointed directly to Shelley's killer. On November 4th, almost 2 months after the murder, police moved in to make an arrest, and Elsie had a very clear idea of what had happened to Shelley. Back on Thursday, September 10th, just after 10:30 a.m., the killer drove to Shelley's apartment complex and put on a pair of latex gloves. They climbed the stairs to the apartment and used a key to unlock the door. They quietly walked in, closing the door behind them. Once inside, they went straight to Shelley's closed bedroom. Slowly, so as not to make any noise, they turned the handle and opened the door. Shelley was fast asleep. The killer slowly walked to the bed, pulled out a knife, raised it up, and then brought it down into Shelley's neck. And then before she could scream, the killer stabbed her again and again and again. The killer stabbed Shelley 42 times in the neck and back before they finally stopped and stepped away from the bed. Shelley would die without ever waking up. After the attack, the killer went into the bathroom. There, they climbed into the bathtub, took off their bloody clothes, and put them into a bag, but in the process, they got spots of blood on the edges of the tub. Then the killer went to the sink and rinsed the last of the blood off their hands, never taking their gloves off. The killer then got dressed in the fresh clothes they brought along. Then they left the apartment, closing and locking the door behind them. When Detective Elsie looked into the 3 alibis of the 3 suspects, initially it seemed like they all checked out. Ashley had been in class, Daniel really had gone to Walmart, and Nathan was in the computer lab for 6 long hours. But while Ashley was in class, something strange was happening. She was getting a near constant stream of text messages asking where she was and if she was home. Elsie believed these text messages were the murderer trying to make sure the house was empty except for Shelley. And the person who sent all those text messages to Ashley was Nathan's roommate, Daniel. Then, when investigators studied surveillance footage from Daniel's trip to Walmart on the morning of the murder, Detective Elsie caught something crucial. Daniel had purchased hair dye, just like he said, but he also purchased blue latex gloves. And the crime lab determined that the material from the brand of gloves matched that little blue piece of latex that had been found on Shelley's wrist. From there, Daniel's alibi fell apart. Surveillance showed he left Walmart at 10:12 a.m., but police could find no evidence that he went by a friend's apartment like he claimed he had. Police then began to look into whether Daniel's story about his roommate Nathan stalking Shelley was actually true, but it turned out if anybody was stalking and obsessed with Shelley, it was actually Daniel. Lots of his own friends said he disliked Shelley because she was dating Nathan, and Daniel was really interested in Nathan to the point where it seemed like he was romantically interested, despite the fact that Daniel denied that. And then also, Daniel would apparently send these aggressive text messages directly to Shelley sometimes, openly disapproving of her and Nathan's relationship, further making it seem like his motive for harming Shelley was because he wanted Nathan for himself. The last piece of the puzzle for Detective Elsie was figuring out how Daniel got into Shelley's apartment. Elsie discovered that Daniel had once borrowed Ashley's car keys, and that gave him the opportunity to make a duplicate of her and Shelley's apartment key, which he then used on the day of the murder. On November 4th, 2011, Daniel was convicted of Shelley's murder and sentenced to life in prison. After the conviction, Shelley's mother found Nathan and gave him a big hug and told him she was sorry for suspecting him and not shaking his hand at the memorial. He accepted her apology. Shelley's family created a scholarship in her honor. Every year since 2011, they've given it out to a student who was pursuing a degree in the arts. One morning in the spring of 2009, 39-year-old Dr. Benjamin Gilmer quietly got dressed before dawn without waking his sleeping wife and young son. He walked out the front door of his home in Asheville, North Carolina. He got in his car and pulled off into the foggy morning. Benjamin drove about 15 miles until the city streets became narrow country roads. In the distance, he saw the peaks of green mountains jutting into the sky. The area was breathtaking. But Benjamin's stomach was in knots. He was about to start his new job as a doctor at the Cane Creek Clinic, a rural medical center in the small town of Fletcher. A few minutes later, Benjamin turned off the main road and into the driveway of an old, repurposed farmhouse. The farmhouse was the clinic's location, which had been founded by another doctor whose last name was Gilmer, except this doctor's name was Vince Gilmer. Benjamin found it odd that he happened to share the same last name as the previous doctor. He knew it would confuse some patients. In fact, having the same last name as the clinic's founder had almost kept him from getting the job. The board of directors was hesitant to hire him because the first Dr. Gilmer had done something so heinous that they wanted to completely disassociate themselves from that name. Dr. Vince Gilmer had murdered his own father and mutilated the corpse 5 years earlier on June 28, 2004. He was now serving a life sentence in prison. Benjamin Gilmer understood why having the same last name as this killer would give the board of directors pause. But Benjamin was grateful that they gave him a chance. His goal wasn't to work in a big hospital or make a ton of money, it was to help people who needed it most in small communities. Benjamin parked, then got out of his car and walked toward the clinic. He took a deep breath and then stepped through the creaky front door. The clinic wouldn't open for another 10 minutes, but there were already a handful of people sitting in the waiting area reading the local paper. A few people glanced up at him, but no one gave him a strange look. He smiled and waved back, relieved that he didn't seem to be causing any confusion. Benjamin headed into the back and greeted his staff, who had already been told Benjamin was not related to the other Dr. Gilmer. Benjamin checked his busy schedule. He had back-to-back-to-back appointments from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. He refilled his coffee mug, put on his white coat, and got to work. By the end of the day, 6 p.m., he was tired and ready to go home. But he had one more patient to see, a woman who was there for a follow-up on her arthritis. But when he walked into the exam room, he was startled by what he saw. The woman was sitting on the exam table with her head down almost to her knees, and she was hyperventilating. Her breaths were shallow and her face was pale. She was clearly having a panic attack. But as soon as Benjamin stepped all the way into the room and shut the door, the woman looked up at him and visibly began to relax. Her breathing slowed down and her color started to come back. Once she had steadied herself, she reached out and touched Benjamin's shoulder and apologized. When the nurse had first mentioned she'd be seeing Dr. Gilmer, she was terrified because she thought it would be the other Dr. Gilmer, the murderer. Benjamin smiled and told her it was all right, he was just glad she was feeling better. Once the woman was ready, Benjamin began to examine her, and as he checked her vitals, they talked about the other Dr. Gilmer, Vince Gilmer. Despite her fear that it was going to be the first Dr. Gilmer walking into the exam room, she had said to the new Dr. Gilmer that she actually only had fond memories of Vince Gilmer. She remembered Vince as being very kind and caring before she found out he had murdered his father. One time when she was at the clinic, she'd seen Vince rescue a mouse from a no-kill mousetrap. Then he walked out back and released it right next to a koi pond he'd built himself. He cared deeply about every living thing, which had made his crime all the more shocking to her. Benjamin thanked her for being so open. He prescribed some medication for her arthritis, walked her back to the waiting room, and then he returned to his office. Benjamin wrote up his patient notes from the day, and then he left the clinic. But on the way home, he kept thinking about Vince Gilmer. He wondered how a man who had been a doctor, committed to saving lives, was now serving a life sentence for murder. His mind wandered as the trees on the side of the highway whipped by. Benjamin blinked and forced his eyes to stay on the road. He didn't want to think about a murderer, especially one who shared his last name. Finally, Benjamin arrived home, he had some dinner, and then he crawled into bed and fell asleep. Over the next several months, Benjamin tried to push thoughts of Vince Gilmer out of his head. Taking over the clinic was a demanding job, and Benjamin often worked 14-hour days. But even when he was busy, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Vince's story. Time and time again, longtime patients who came into the clinic who had known Vince Gilmer would tell Benjamin about Vince's generosity and compassion, how he would take payment in the form of corn and tomatoes from patients who could not afford to pay the bill, how he still made house calls, how he treated everyone with decency and respect. Benjamin just couldn't believe someone like Vince could transform into a violent criminal with no explanation. He wondered if there could be a medical explanation for Vince to snap and become this killer. Did something break inside of him? Until he knew more, Benjamin just could not let it go. A few weeks later, Benjamin's receptionist walked into the clinic with a stack of newspaper articles about Vince Gilmer. She knew about Benjamin's interest in the case and had done some research on her own at the local library. Benjamin eagerly sat down at his desk at the end of the day, clearing away his medical reports and charts to focus on the newspapers. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was excited to find out any new information about Vince Gilmer that was not just word of mouth. As he read the articles, Benjamin discovered that Vince had actually been about Benjamin's age when he killed his father, Dalton Gilmer, 5 years ago. Dalton had been diagnosed with some form of schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, which is a form of dementia. He had been living in a psychiatric hospital that treated Alzheimer's patients. The part about schizophrenia caught Benjamin's attention. He wondered if Vince inherited a genetic vulnerability to the crippling mental disorder. But as he thought more about the possible link, it seemed unlikely. Schizophrenia typically appears in early adulthood, and he doubted that Vince could have developed the disease without any prior signs. There are some cases that appear later in life, but they're rare. Whatever changed in Vince had changed suddenly. Benjamin kept reading. On the day of the murder, Vince was supposed to come help his father, Dalton, move to a nursing home, and witnesses saw him come pick Dalton up. But 2 days later, Vince reported his father missing, claiming he'd brought his father back home, and then he'd probably just wandered off. Vince had no idea that the police had already found his dad's body on a road 2 hours' drive from the hospital, and there was evidence linking Vince to the murder. The articles said that Vince had told police during the investigation that he had not been feeling like himself lately because he was withdrawing from an antidepressant medication called Lexapro. People who suddenly stop taking antidepressants can experience a range of symptoms, including trouble sleeping, nausea, and psychological reactions such as suicidal impulses or psychosis. The articles also said that Vince had gotten seriously injured in a car accident about a year before the murder, and after that, he and his wife had divorced. Now, Benjamin's mind was racing. Was it possible that the combined effects of antidepressant withdrawal and a bad head injury from a car accident could have dramatically altered Vince's personality? Could they have transformed him into a murderer? It was getting late, and he should have been home by now. His wife was probably wondering where he was, but before Benjamin shut off his light, he noticed a blurry photo of Vince from one of the articles. He looked big and burly. He had a shaved head, and he was wearing a prison jumpsuit. His eyes seemed haunted. Benjamin suddenly felt like he was trying to build a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces, but he didn't have the time to figure out what he was missing. Over the next year, Benjamin's life got much more hectic. He and his wife had a second child, and he was just so busy running the clinic that ultimately he was not able to keep up his research into Vince. And if Benjamin was being honest with himself, he knew the Vince Gilmer subject was taking up way too much space in his head. His obsession with this murderer would just have to wait until he had more time to think. In the spring of 2011, 3 years after Benjamin began his research into Vince, Benjamin was in a meeting at the clinic when he received a phone call. The caller identified herself as Sarah Koenig, a journalist from New York. Sarah had heard about the case of the previous Dr. Gilmer, and she was interested to find out more. In fact, Sarah wanted to do a podcast about it. She asked Benjamin if he would be willing to speak with her about his experiences as the second Dr. Gilmer at the clinic. Benjamin was intrigued by Sarah's call, But he was also hesitant. He didn't want to get sucked back into Vince's dark past, so he told her he was actually not interested in doing the podcast. But after he hung up, his old feelings began to resurface. He wanted to move on with his life, but he just couldn't forget about Vince Gilmer. It took another year, but Benjamin would call Sarah back. Now he wanted to be a part of her project if she was still interested. Shortly after Benjamin called in the spring of 2012, Sarah came out to North Carolina and they got to work. Sarah interviewed Benjamin first. To his surprise, Benjamin felt himself tearing up as he talked about Vince's story. It was cathartic for him to finally let out how invested he had become in this stranger's life. Together, he and Sarah planned to interview Vince's old patients, friends, and coworkers. The first person on their list was Vince's old office manager, Terry. She had seen Vince's decline firsthand. So one night, they met Terry in another office space near the clinic. Sarah prepared the recording equipment and then tapped the microphone to test it. Benjamin could see Terry shift in her seat. She was nervous. He understood. He'd felt the same way. Sarah pressed the record button and the interview began. Terry took a deep breath and described when she thought Vince's personality first started to change. It was about a year before the murder, in 2003. Vince's truck had hit a telephone pole and overturned. First responders found him unconscious, and an ambulance had rushed him to Mission Hospital in Asheville. And when Vince woke up, he didn't know his own name, and he didn't recognize his wife. Terry said Vince's amnesia cleared up after about 24 hours, but after that crash, he was never really the same. Her voice shook as she told Benjamin about how Vince had filed for divorce, moved into a new house alone, started drinking heavily, and began dating random women. He got into debt and spent money he didn't have. Clearly, Vince's mental health had gone steadily downhill in the last year before the murder. And so Benjamin wondered why Vince was even found mentally competent to stand trial. Benjamin decided he needed to see the official documents from Vince's trial in hopes of getting some new insight. The week after Sarah came to visit, Benjamin drove to Washington County, Virginia, where Vince's trial had taken place. He asked the court clerk for all documents available on Dr. Vince Gilmer and received a thick stack of papers, hundreds of pages long. It was the transcript from Vince's trial. Vince had insisted on representing himself in court and argued that he was not in his right mind when he murdered his father due to antidepressant withdrawal. He had stopped taking them cold turkey 2 days before the murder. But Vince didn't present any expert medical witnesses who could corroborate this theory, and he didn't even bring up the bout of amnesia he suffered after his car crash. The prosecution argued that Vince was faking an illness to escape punishment. They presented a psychiatrist who had judged Vince to be perfectly sane the night he killed his father. The jury agreed and found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. Benjamin wasn't sure what to think. On the one hand, a traumatic brain injury and antidepressant withdrawal could explain the dark turn in Vince's personality. On the other hand, he could see why the jury believed the prosecution. Killing and mutilating your father is something a sociopath would do. When Benjamin got back home, he talked it over with Sarah. They both agreed there was only one way to get the full story. The two Dr. Gilmers would have to meet directly. It took several months to organize, but in early January of 2013, Benjamin and Sarah made the 2-hour drive to Wallens Ridge State Prison in Virginia. The maximum security building was huge and flat, a cinder block fortress nestled deep in the Virginia mountains. After Benjamin parked and stepped out of the car, he immediately heard the buzzing sound of the electrified razor wire lining the prison's fence. He noticed snipers perched on guard towers. The place made Benjamin extremely nervous. He and Sarah left their belongings in the car, they showed their IDs to the guard, and then walked through the metal detectors. Finally, they were led down a hallway to the visiting area. The room was large and filled with long metal tables. Benjamin could smell old food and bleach. It almost felt like a school cafeteria, except for the fact that prison guards loomed in the corners and each table had a metal divider down the middle to separate inmates from visitors. Benjamin and Sarah sat down at one of the tables and waited. A few minutes later, an old man shuffled slowly into the room. He was rail thin with a gaunt face and barely any hair. Benjamin watched the old man walk, thinking he must be visiting someone else. But then the old man pulled a chair out at their table. It was Vince. He was 50 years old, but looked nothing like the burly, broad-shouldered man Benjamin had seen in older photos. Benjamin could feel his heart pounding. This was the man he'd been fixated on for the past 4 years. He took a breath and then introduced himself, but it seemed like Vince barely heard him. Vince kept opening and closing his mouth, almost like he was chewing, except he didn't have any food in his mouth. Benjamin could see he was missing most of his teeth. Vince's eyes wandered around the room as he clenched and unclenched his hands. He was trying to speak, but he was clearly struggling. Slowly, Vince began to talk about the voices in his head and how his brain didn't work. After a while, he seemed to run out of things to say. There was an awkward silence, so Sarah stepped in. She followed up with questions that Benjamin didn't have the nerve to ask. Questions like why Vince killed his father and whether he planned it. Vince seemed to expect the questions. He slowly answered that he hadn't planned it. He said the voices in his head told him to do it, but there was just a lot he couldn't remember. Looking at him now, Benjamin felt certain that Vince was not a psychopath. He wasn't evil or manipulative, and he wasn't faking these symptoms. He was suffering, and for years, nobody had believed him. Now, Benjamin had new questions for himself. What exactly was Vince sick with, and was there any potential treatment? Just then, a prison guard walked over and told Benjamin and Sarah that their time was up. Vince stared at them, his eyes brimming with tears, and he asked them to please help him. Benjamin promised he would try, and then he and Sarah said goodbye. They left the prison and drove the winding roads back to North Carolina. About a week after visiting the prison, Benjamin realized he might actually know someone who could help Vince. Benjamin grabbed his phone and he called a colleague named Dr. Steve Bowie. Benjamin knew Dr. Bowie from a nearby medical school where they both sometimes taught classes. Dr. Bowie was a psychiatrist and an expert at diagnosing brain diseases and mental illnesses. Benjamin called Dr. Bowie up and poured out Vince's story. Benjamin told Dr. Bowie that, in his opinion, Vince had been showing signs of some kind of brain disease for at least a decade, and his condition had only deteriorated since he was imprisoned, and if Vince didn't get help soon, he could die. 3 days later, Benjamin drove with Dr. Bowie through the Virginia mountains, discussing Vince's case as they headed back towards the prison. Dr. Bowie didn't think antidepressant withdrawal could be the answer. It had been 9 years since the crime, which meant it had been 9 years since Vince stopped taking his antidepressants, yet his symptoms seemed to have only worsened. There was just no way he could still be going through drug withdrawal after so much time. And Dr. Bowie didn't think Vince's car accident could explain his behavior either. He'd worked with many patients who had traumatic brain injuries, and their symptoms did not match Vince's. Benjamin was confused. He wanted to believe that Vince had been driven to kill by forces beyond his control, but if neither a traumatic brain injury or the Lexapro withdrawal had caused Vince to kill, then what could it be? Maybe, Benjamin thought, Vince belonged in prison after all. After almost 4 years of digging into Vince's case, Benjamin didn't want to believe that he could have been so wrong about Vince. Benjamin sighed, not knowing what to think. Benjamin and Dr. Bowie eventually arrived at the prison, and they parked the car in the prison's parking lot. Benjamin led Dr. Bowie through security, down the prison's echoey hallways, and into the visitation area. Vince eventually walked in, looking just as sick as the last time Benjamin visited. He seemed happy to see Benjamin, though, and he smiled. But then, after he sat down, his lips curled into an exaggerated frown, and he squeezed his eyes shut, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he tried to lay them flat on the table. Dr. Bowie asked Vince questions about the night of the murder, and Vince sort of stumbled through a slow recounting. Dr. Bowie listened patiently, and when Vince finished, Dr. Bowie asked him something that was totally unexpected. He wanted to know what it was like growing up with his father. Vince looked off in the distance for a moment, then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described painful childhood memories. His father was a Vietnam War veteran who drank to excess, especially after returning home from combat, and he was a cruel man who had sexually abused Vince for as long as he could remember. Vince tried to answer more questions, but after a while, a guard came over and said it was time to go. Back in the car, Benjamin asked Dr. Bowie what he thought of Vince. The psychiatrist leaned back in his seat with a thoughtful expression on his face. He told Benjamin that he was more certain than ever that Vince's condition had nothing to do with antidepressant withdrawal or a traumatic brain injury. But he was also convinced that Vince did not murder his father out of pure hate. In fact, he had a new theory for what was wrong with Vince. When he explained it, Benjamin just sat there, stunned. He'd never even considered something like what Dr. Bowie was suggesting. But if Dr. Bowie was right, it would explain everything. They just needed a DNA test to prove it. It took some time, but they did eventually get everything in order. Dr. Bowie had to get the prison hospital to obtain a blood sample from Vince, send it off for testing, and then wait for it to be processed. The DNA results came back a few months later in March of 2013. Benjamin was at work, sitting in his rusty desk chair, when he saw an email notification on his computer from the prison hospital. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the email. The diagnosis was finally there in black and white. It explained everything, from Vince's car accident to his increasingly strange behavior to the murder that landed him behind bars. This is what really happened on the day that Dr. Vince Gilmer killed his father, and why he did it. On the afternoon of June 28, 2004, Vince left the clinic early. He drove home, he grabbed a canoe from his garage and lifted it onto the top of his pickup truck. He strapped the canoe down and then got back into his truck and drove across town. About an hour later, he parked in front of the huge, multi-story brick building where his father lived, Broughton Hospital. Vince went inside and told the receptionist he was there to pick up his father, Dalton. Dalton had been living at this hospital for 2 years, being treated for what doctors thought was schizophrenia and Alzheimer's. His overall health was deteriorating, and so Vince was there to check him out of Broughton Hospital and bring him to a nursing home in North Carolina where he could live out his final days. Vince helped his father out the door and into the passenger seat of the truck. Then Vince got into the driver's seat and he told his father he had a surprise. Instead of going straight to the nursing home, Vince was going to take him to one of his favorite places, a lake in Tennessee where they could canoe together. But while they were making this 70-mile drive to the lake, Dalton started making these horrible sexual comments towards his own son. Unfortunately, this was not anything new. Vince had heard it all before, and he could ignore it. But then his father started humming the tune of Ba Ba Black Sheep, the song that Vince's father used to hum while he abused Vince when he was a boy. For Vince, the sound of that song brought back a flood of traumatic memories. It was like a psychological trigger, and in that moment, something broke in Vince's mind. He began to hear voices all around him and inside his head demanding that he kill his father. The more he tried to resist, the stronger they became. The urge to kill his father became overwhelming. His head was pounding and he felt like he was losing control. The tires screeched as he swerved onto the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. The car stopped so quickly that his father's head jerked forward, then back, knocking into the headrest. Vince's eyes locked onto his dog's leash, which he'd left lying over the passenger seat headrest. The voices screamed at Vince to use it. And so Vince grabbed one end of this leash, he wrapped the other end around his father's neck, and then he pulled as tight as he could. Dalton was too sick and frail to fight back. He died of strangulation. Afterward, it was still. All Vince could hear were the crickets and his own breathing. Vince drove around for hours with his father's body sitting up in the passenger seat. Eventually, he pulled over on a rural road in Virginia. It was dark and deserted. Vince knew he'd just done something absolutely terrible, and as he sat in the truck, his heart began to race. The quiet in his head was now replaced by a jumble of whispers and then shouts. The voices were back, and their message was clear. They were telling him he was going to get caught unless he covered his tracks. Vince stepped out of the truck and walked around to the passenger side. He dragged his father's body and left it in a grassy patch on the side of the road. Then he rushed to the back of his truck and scooped up a pair of his gardening shears. He returned to the body, picked up one of his father's fingers, and began to cut. It took some effort because the blades were worn, but in a few minutes it was done. The finger landed on the dry leaves with a soft thud. Then, one by one, Vince cut the rest of his father's fingers off. The voices told him to take the fingers. So Vince gathered them up, got back into his truck, and sped away from the crime scene. A few hours later, a Virginia police officer found Dalton's body while it was still warm. The missing fingers shocked him, but he didn't have any problems figuring out who this victim was. He found name tags from Broughton Hospital in Dalton's shorts and in his shirt. Detectives quickly learned that Vince had picked Dalton up from the hospital that afternoon. Within a few days, police were at Vince's house in North Carolina arresting him for murder. They never found his father's fingers, even though Vince said he dumped them in his clinic's koi pond. But they did find blood-stained paper towels in Vince's truck. When Vince was tried, he had said he was just as shocked by his behavior as everybody else was. And now, nearly a decade later, Benjamin finally understood what was actually wrong with Vince's mind, and he now had the lab results to prove it. Benjamin read the words from the prison hospital's email over and over. Vince had Huntington's disease. Benjamin opened up an internet browser. He'd studied Huntington's in medical school, but it was so rare that he'd never diagnosed it in his career as a doctor. He began looking up articles in medical journals to refresh himself on the details. The articles described Huntington's as being a sort of cross between three diseases that are each absolutely terrible: ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. It was a degenerative neurological disease, meaning it caused a person's brain cells to break down and die. This created physical and psychological problems like involuntary movements, cognitive impairments, memory loss, intense personality changes, and psychosis. The Huntington's diagnosis lined up with all the symptoms Vince experienced. And while the majority of Huntington's patients weren't violent, the disease could cause people to act out in ways they normally would not. Benjamin thought that Vince might have been struggling with multiple problems at once. While a traumatic brain injury and antidepressant withdrawal could not explain his actions on their own, they could have combined with Huntington's disease to create a perfect storm of mental and physical illnesses that totally changed Vince's personality and behavior. Benjamin kept reading. Huntington's was genetic, meaning it got passed down from parent to child. If someone's mother or father had Huntington's disease, then they had a 50-50 chance of getting it as well. Suddenly, everything clicked for Benjamin. The doctors at Broughton Hospital thought Vince's father, Dalton, had schizophrenia and dementia. But it was much more likely that Dalton had Huntington's. He was the one who passed it on to Vince. To Benjamin, the entire story was a tragedy. Two men, a father and son, who shared the same mental illness, both doing unspeakable things to each other. Then Benjamin read something else that made his heart sink even further. Huntington's is a death sentence. There is no known cure, and the disease will eventually kill its victim. All Benjamin could do was try to get Vince the mental health care he needed. Today, Benjamin still has a close relationship with Vince. His goal is to help Vince get out of prison and into a proper treatment facility. In January of 2022, the governor of Virginia granted Vince clemency on the condition that a place was found for him at a psychiatric hospital. Technically, this made Vince a free man, but it wasn't as simple as him just walking out of prison and into a hospital, because every public mental health facility in Virginia refused to take him in, and a stay at a private hospital was far too expensive. Benjamin continues to work hard to find a hospital for Vince, who remains in Wallens Ridge State Prison. He hopes that one day, the first Dr. Gilmer will receive the psychiatric care that he needs. On the afternoon of July 9, 2001, a 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen carried a bag of camping supplies through the woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody had come to the woods for a camping trip with his dad and his Boy Scout troop. But about 30 minutes earlier, he had broken off from the main group. They were over at camp, and he had hiked a couple of miles to his dad's truck to pick up some extra camping supplies. And now that he had those supplies, he had turned around and begun hiking back towards the rest of the group. As Cody hiked along, he kind of let his mind wander. He was thinking about what story he was going to tell that night around the campfire to impress the other Boy Scouts. But as he was thinking about it and kind of walking along, he started to realize that things didn't look familiar. And at some point, he started to wonder, why haven't I actually reached the campsite yet? And at that point, he stopped, he didn't panic, and he just kind of looked around and realized that he actually had left the path. He was not even in an area that he had seen before. And so being a Boy Scout, he kind of stayed calm, and he just turned around and decided he would retrace his steps back to his dad's truck and start again. He would obviously be very late back to camp, but at least he'd come back in one piece. But as he retraced his steps, he really didn't know where he had come from, because again, he had sort of left the trail because his mind was wandering. And so before long, Cody realized he was totally lost, and he started to panic. Hours passed by as Cody frantically walked around the woods, calling out for help, but not hearing anybody calling back to him. And then as the sun began to set, he also noticed that storm clouds were rolling in. And so this situation was becoming dire very quickly. But he told himself, don't worry, my father and the Boy Scout troop, they clearly know by this point that I'm missing and they must be out looking for me. But Cody knew there was no telling how long it would take for them to find him. I mean, it could be hours or it could be days. Or the thought was totally terrifying, but they might not find him at all. But at this point, Cody was able to calm himself down and tell himself, hey, you're a Boy Scout. You can do this. You can at least stay out here, make a shelter, build a fire, and kind of just wait while someone comes to find you. That's all you can do at this point. And so he had his bag of supplies with him, and so he took it off and he dumped the contents out, and quickly he realized the contents of this bag were not going to help him. Certainly not going to help him build a fire or shelter. But worse than that was there also wasn't any food, and he barely had any water. So effectively, he had nothing. And then, of course, to make matters even worse, the sky suddenly let loose, and Cody was caught in a major thunderstorm. And so Cody rounded up whatever he could, threw it in his bag, and just started running in the dark through the trees as hail is pelting him and it's thunder and lightning, and he's got no idea what he's gonna do. And then suddenly lightning flashes across the sky, and for a second the forest is illuminated, and right up ahead of him is this cave. And so Cody runs into the cave and he takes shelter inside of it. It's pouring rain outside, it's so loud, it's so chaotic, and he's terrified. But now it's like his body just shuts down. He's so overwhelmed, he's so scared as he's laying there wondering, am I gonna die out here? That he just closes his eyes and passes out just from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, Cody woke up still sheltering inside of this cave. And the first thing he noticed is when he looked out into the woods was the storm had stopped, the rain had let up. And then the second thing he noticed was he heard the distinct sound of a helicopter flying somewhere nearby. Cody instantly ran out of the cave and looked up into the sky, and sure enough, there was this small helicopter flying around roughly in his area. And so using some of his Boy Scout training, he pulled off his belt and he used the metal buckle of his belt to reflect the sunlight back up at the pilot to get the pilot's attention. And it worked. He got the pilot clearly to notice him, and before long, he noticed the pilot hovering down lower and lower right over the tree line, looking for a place to land. And so Cody is so overjoyed, he's about to be saved. He grabs his stuff and just charges over roughly to the area where the pilot's trying to land. And by the time he gets in that vicinity, he sees the pilot actually touching down in a clearing. Cody can't believe it. It's only been one day and he's been found. And so Cody runs over to the helicopter, throws the door open, gets inside, and the pilot just turns around and says, "Good morning." And Cody, at first, doesn't really register what's happening here. He's only just completely relieved that he is going to survive. But then he kind of stops and looks at the pilot, and he can't believe who it is that's just rescued him. It would turn out, the night before, when Cody did not return to the camp, his father and the Boy Scout troop did contact authorities, and before long, a local search party was organized. And one of those people who volunteered to be a part of the search was an amateur pilot who lived in the area. That helicopter pilot was the one who found Cody 10 miles away from his Boy Scout troop's camp. When that pilot reunited Cody with his father, Cody's father naturally assumed that, given the trauma of the last 24 hours, that Cody would not want to rejoin the Boy Scout troop and continue this camping trip, that he would want to go home. But instead, Cody said, "No, I want to go back to the Boy Scout troop. I want to sit there and tell them what happened to me, because now I have a campfire story that they are not gonna believe." Cody had trekked 10 miles through the wilderness all alone, spent the night with bears out in a cave somewhere in the middle of a storm, and then ultimately got rescued by this amateur helicopter pilot who happened to be, at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. The amateur pilot was the actor who had played Han Solo in Star Wars, he was Indiana Jones, and had starred in several other major blockbuster movies. It was none other than Harrison Ford. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. He coughed and wheezed as he slowly walked down the hall next to other sick kids as they made their way towards the hospital's classroom. Now, Rich didn't know what kind of lesson he and the other kids were going to get today, but frankly, he didn't care. Anything was better than just sitting in his hospital room, bored out of his mind. So Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And over the past 10 weeks, he'd been bouncing around to different hospitals, and in fact, his condition was still so bad that this hospital had informed his parents that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And as awful as this sounded to Rich, this actually was not the first time something like this had happened to him. When he was 6 years old, his appendix burst, and then he contracted an infection that left him in a coma for several weeks. And then when he came out of the coma, he had to recover in a hospital for nearly a year. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. And because his family was not a well-off family, they couldn't afford to hire a tutor to kind of keep Rich up to speed. And so basically at this point, Rich's education consisted of, whatever random classes these hospitals he was staying in sporadically had. Whenever they hired a teacher to come in and teach basket weaving or, shop class, whatever was available, that was his education. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he did not have high expectations about what he would be taught that day. He figured it was just going to be some random class that he would sit through that at least was keeping him out of his hospital bedroom. But the instant he saw the teacher for the day and saw what was surrounding the teacher, he was really excited because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. He had seen one day in a Windows shop a drum set and he had wanted it so badly, but his family didn't have the money to pay for it, so he had never had a chance to do it. But now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so when the teacher began handing out the instruments to the kids, Rich demanded that he get the drum set. He would not play anything else. And the teacher was like, okay. And so he was given the drum. And then that day, the teacher led the class, through a couple of basic songs, and Rich played the drum, and he and everybody else were objectively terrible, like the music was awful. But by the end of the class, Rich was totally revitalized here. I mean, he hadn't discovered some special new talent for playing the drums, but he had discovered that he had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. And then also every few weeks, when the music teacher came back to the hospital, Rich would go to those classes and he would try to learn as much as he possibly could from the teacher. And that was basically his whole life, was those classes and banging on everything he could. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, despite having his health back, it isn't like his life suddenly got a whole lot easier. It isn't like, he left the hospital and, magically became this amazing drummer and that was his life. Instead, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. And for Rich, he felt like that was the right thing to do. He didn't resent his family. This is what his life was. And what he did is he found joy, while he was working in grabbing makeshift drumsticks and just banging on stuff any chance he could. And he figured that that would be his life. He would just work and, find joy in drumming whenever he could. But Rich's outlook on life changed dramatically on Christmas of 1956, so a year after he'd left the hospital. Because on that Christmas, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. To this point, Rich had not been able to have his own drum set. Everything was makeshift. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit, and Rich is like, this is the best gift I've ever been given. And he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off. And before long, he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right, as Rich is kind of hitting his stride, being this kind of local celebrity, this local very popular band fired their drummer. And so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, hey, will you join our band? And Rich said, let's do it. By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles. Around 11 a.m. on Sunday, October 20th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their home in Oakland, California. And the first thing Will noticed as soon as he was awake was the smell of smoke. Will got out of his bed and went to the window, and when he looked out, he could see there was this big plume of smoke coming from what looked like right outside of his neighborhood. And since he lived in California, where wildfires were unfortunately a common reality, he thought that's got to be a wildfire. So Will called 911 to report it, but the dispatcher told him that yes, that is a wildfire. It's on a mountainside, about 600 feet away from Will's house in his neighborhood. But they said the fire department was already all over it, and the smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover, after the fire had been put out. So no real threat here. And so after hearing this, Will's mind was put at ease. He thanked the dispatcher and hung up, and then he went about his normal morning routine. And as he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander towards work. So Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on this video game about ants, like the insects, and how they go about building their homes. And Will was really excited about this game. But as Will left the bathroom and happened to look out the window that he looked out before and saw that plume of smoke out on the mountainside, any thoughts of his video game immediately vanished. Because now he was looking out and he saw this huge cloud of smoke that, in addition to being much bigger, there was also obvious flames licking up. Like, clearly the fire is not extinguished, and worse, it appeared the fire was moving in the direction of his neighborhood, and pretty quickly. And so Will immediately grabs the phone and he calls 911 again, and he reports that, hey, I'm seeing a fire here. and he could tell just from the dispatcher's voice that they were kind of surprised. They felt like the fire was under control. Like, what are you talking about? And so Will realized, like, based on this response, I can't afford to wait for help. I mean, it's unclear if they even know what's going on here, and this fire appears to be moving right towards me. And so after hanging up with the dispatcher, Will knew he had to act. And so Will runs to his wife, who by this point, she's looking out the window too. She's terrified. And they're like, what are we gonna do here? And they decide, we just gotta evacuate. Like, by this point, the fire is literally coming right towards them. The smoke is beginning to overwhelm them. And so they just grabbed a couple of bare necessities. They charged out of their house and they're looking down the street. And again, the smoke by this point is kind of, making it hard to see, but they can see other neighbors are frantically getting in their cars to evacuate as well. And Will and his wife, they're about to speed off when they remember their neighbors had gone away for the weekend and they had left their old parents to look after their 2-year-old kid, and they didn't have a car. And so Will's like, oh my gosh, he runs next door, he pounds on the door, and the grandparents, they come out and they're scared as well. They have the 2-year-old, and Will's like, come on. They grabbed a couple of necessities, they hopped in Will's car, and before long, all of them were peeling down the road, evacuating. 1 week later, Will returned to his neighborhood, this time in the passenger seat of a police cruiser, because you needed an official escort to be able to go into this area because of how dangerous it was. There was debris everywhere. When the police officer stopped in front of Will's address and Will got out, he looked at where his house used to be and it was just gone. Like every other house in his neighborhood, it was completely leveled by this fire. That fire burned for 4 days, destroyed thousands of homes, including basically Will's entire neighborhood, and it killed 25 people. Will walked towards the rubble that used to be his home, and as he stood there surveying the area, he was hit with this epiphany. He didn't really care that he had lost all of his things, like everything he owned basically had been destroyed by this fire, but he just didn't care. Instead, all he cared about and all he was grateful for was his family. Like, they had survived, they'd escaped the fire. That's what mattered. And so as he's standing there, sort of a little bit numb to what's happened here, he looked down and he saw ants. Now remember, he was developing this video game about ants, and so had done tons of research about ants. And he saw these ants that definitely were destroyed by this fire as much as the people were. I mean, their colonies were all burnt up and destroyed as well. But he saw these ants, and what they were doing was gathering supplies and rebuilding, brick by brick. That's what they were doing. That's what ants do. They simply go forward and rebuild, no matter the tragedy. And this gave Will an idea. 9 years later, Will finally released his video game. But it was not the game he had been developing, the one about ants. Instead, it was inspired by the ants he saw marching through the rubble after this horrible fire. In this game he made, you could create characters like avatars who could live entire digital lives, complete with homes and neighbors and spouses and kids and friends. Like, it really was an actual universe in this game. But this game is not set in a perfect fantasy world. Instead, the universe that these characters live inside of is meant to mimic the real world that we live in, where tragedies can strike, and often do, sort of unpredictably. Death, destruction, wildfires, you name it, that's just kind of part of living in this world. And so in this game, characters periodically would just have horrible things happen to them, and they would have to rebuild, just like the ants had to rebuild, and just like Will and his family and everybody else affected by that fire. You just have to move forward and rebuild. Will's game wound up being a massive success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide, and today hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people still play it. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. Late on the night of Friday, September 18th, 2015, a 45-year-old man named Lattori Barman stumbled down a pitch-black street in a small village in central India. Lattori was stumbling because he was very, very drunk. He and his wife had spent most of the night together out at this local fair, having loads to drink and partying, and then at some point his wife had actually broken off and gone to her parents' house in another village, but Lattori had decided to stay out and keep the fun rolling. And so once she was gone, Latore had gone to a liquor store and had more to drink there. And then now he had finally decided he had had enough. He was extremely intoxicated and he just wanted to get back home. And so as Latore stumbled down this road, he could really only see maybe a foot in front of him. Not only because he was so drunk, but also because the streets in his village did not have lights. And so it was totally dark. However, this wasn't unusual for Latore. I mean, this is where he lived. He'd walked the street many, many times and knew how to navigate without any lighting. And so he just continued walking along, business as usual. But what did strike him as odd is that, late at night here, as he's making his way home, he thought it was weird that there was a lot of people out on the road. He couldn't really see them because, again, there's no lighting, but he could definitely hear them. Like there was people sort of all over the place. And he also sort of in his intoxicated state saw some lights that, maybe were vehicles sort of moving around. So there was like more activity on this road than usual. But at the same time, like this is a main road and sometimes there's lots of people and cars on it, even late at night. So this didn't really strike him as odd enough to stop and investigate. He just kept on walking towards his house. But as he's walking through with all this commotion all around him, at some point he goes to step, but instead of his foot striking the ground again, there's nothing there. And suddenly he feels himself falling and he smashes into the ground, and now truly it's pitch black. He can't see anything and he blacks out. The following morning, a group of villagers were walking down the same street that Latore had been on the night before. And as they were walking, now in broad daylight, they looked up ahead and they noticed something odd right in the middle of the street. And at first they had no idea what it was, and so they walked closer to it to get a better look. And as they walked up on this thing, they instantly understood what it was. And they screamed and ran to tell authorities. It would turn out the reason Latore was hearing and seeing all these people and, vehicles on the street the night before, which seemed sort of out of place, was because there was actually a construction crew repairing potholes in that road. This road was known for being very dangerous because of these deep potholes. And Latore, as he was stumbling along, accidentally fell into one of these deep potholes, smashed the ground, and was knocked unconscious. And because this worksite was so chaotic and there was all this, movement and there was bad lighting, none of the crew saw Latore fall in. And Latore, even after, coming to inside the hole, was too drunk to get out of the hole. And so at some point that night, the construction crew reached the pothole that Latore was in. They didn't see him, and they poured molten tar into the hole and then rolled over it with a roller, all with Latore inside the hole. And so after they were done and moved on to the next pothole, Latore, in his final moments, tried to kind of pull himself out of this tar, but he only managed to get his hand up and out of the tar. And so the next day, the group of villagers that walked down the road, what did they see? They saw Latore's hand poking out of the ground. Latore's body was removed from the street and he was given a proper burial. There were 2 construction workers who were on duty on the night of Latore's death who were ultimately arrested and charged with culpable homicide. As for Latore's family, authorities would give them a compensation payment for Latore's death, but it was only worth approximately $760 US. Around 2:30 p.m. on November 28, 2015, a man pulled into his driveway in the extremely rural city of Huron, California. He had been away overnight, and so as soon as he got out of his car, he walked right up to his porch and checked his doorknob to make sure his door was still locked. He found that it was, which was a relief. Then he unlocked it and stepped inside. However, as soon as he was inside his house, he just stopped and listened and kind of looked around. So this neighborhood that he lived in was not a safe place to live. In fact, over the past year, this guy's house had been broken into multiple times. However, he had not reported any of these break-ins to the police because he himself was wanted for felony drug possession. And so instead of getting the police involved, the man had sort of begun doing his own home security. Basically, every time he came home, he would sort of take a minute, listen, make sure nobody was in the house, and then actually sweep the house to make sure, nobody was there and that nothing had been stolen. And so as the man stood there in his doorway listening, he couldn't hear anything and nothing looked disturbed inside of his house. So he flipped on the lights, he walked into his living room and put his keys and his wallet down. And then he began doing this kind of systematic sweep through his house, checking to make sure there was nothing wrong. Checked the windows, none were broken, goes to the back door, it's still locked. He's in his kitchen, he's in, his dining room, there's nothing out of place. He did notice, however, that his mail that was sitting on one of his tables looked like maybe it had been rummaged through, but at the same time, he couldn't remember if maybe he had been kind of sloppy when he had gone over his mail before he had left the night before. So he didn't know if the mail was a sign of a break-in, but it didn't seem like it. And so after completing his sweep and feeling confident that the house was, in good order, he sat down and he relaxed. And he felt like, it had been a while since the last break-in, and maybe he was being a bit too paranoid. But for now, he decided, his security protocol was good enough, and he wouldn't make any changes quite yet. And he just picked up the remote, turned on the TV, and settled in for the night. However, after only a couple of minutes, the man realized his house was pretty cold, and he was starting to shiver. So he stood up, and he walked over, and he turned on his heat, and then he sat back down on his couch. And then, about a minute later, this awful, high-pitched scream ripped through the house. It would turn out the homeowner's paranoia around break-ins was totally justified, because the night before, while he was gone, someone had tried to break into his home. 19-year-old Cody Caldwell had snuck onto the roof and attempted to enter this man's house through the chimney, but he got stuck about halfway down. And when the man came home and did his safety patrol and checked his house and couldn't hear or see anything, what he didn't realize was Cody was still absolutely stuck in the chimney and alive. He just wasn't making any sound. And then when the homeowner got cold and turned on the heat, what he literally did was he started an actual fire in his fireplace. And after setting this fire, Cody, who's wedged in the chimney right above this fire, began breathing in the smoke, and in his panic, he began to wiggle around and sink further and further down into this chimney, which is angled, and so he would have gotten more and more stuck until he was basically in the fire and then caught on fire. That scream was him burning alive inside of the chimney. And the man who owned the house had no idea what was going on. He just heard these screams. And then finally, when he got the fire put out and he called the police and the first responders showed up, it was already too late because Cody had died from severe burns and smoke inhalation. On the evening of January 19th, 2022, a 40-year-old mother named Anna Uskova set up a camera and some lights at the edge of a clearing in the woods in St. Petersburg, Russia. Then she focused the camera on the spot in the clearing where she, her husband, and her children were about to perform a very important religious ceremony. So to set the scene here, it was late at night, so it's dark, it was snowing, it's totally freezing. This is the dead of winter out in the middle of Russia. This is a cold, cold environment. But this is when this ceremony was done, in the dead of winter, all over Russia. This was not just something Anna's family was doing, this is like a Russian thing. On this day, all over the country, people would perform this sort of purification ritual that was designed to revitalize their bodies and souls and help them ward off evil spirits for the new year. Now, typically, Anna and her family would perform this big ceremony in a group setting with their church. But this year, Anna decided she wanted to hold this ceremony privately, with just her family kind of out in the woods by themselves. It would be more intimate, and the kids would feel, a bit more involved than they normally did. And so far, it was going great. They had found the perfect location. It was stunningly beautiful. It really felt like the best place to perform this ceremony. But it was kind of odd that when they got there, there was no other families there. They had this place to themselves, which was just crazy. But they thought, great, this is even better for us. This is going to be the perfect ceremony. So while Anna's husband finished prepping everything they would need, Anna hit record on the camera, and then Anna walked out from behind the camera, and you see her come into frame, and she walks over to her kids. And now her kids are going to be performing this ritual the same way Anna and her husband would be, and it's clear they're pretty nervous. Now, they've done this before, but still, this ritual is not very comfortable. It doesn't feel very good, at least in the moment. And so Anna knew this, and so she knelt down with her kids and she kind of reassured them that they were brave, they were courageous, they could do this, and she was gonna go first. And they could see that, once mom did it, they would know that they could do it too. And so at some point, after kind of giving her kids a pep talk, Anna stood up, she walked over to the area that was designated for this ceremony, and then as the camera's rolling, she stood there, she drew a cross on her chest, then she stepped forward and kind of jumped feet first, and then disappeared. 1 second passed with no sign of Anna, and that was okay. But then 2 seconds passed and there was still no sign of Anna. And then 3 seconds passed and still no Anna. And at that point, her husband and her kids began to scream. So what Anna and her family didn't understand, or at a minimum just did not fully appreciate, was that when they did this ceremony with their church every year, the church took a lot of effort to make sure the location they chose for the ceremony, that it was totally safe. And on top of that, they often had medical personnel on standby, just in case. But Anna and her family had not done either of those things. The location they chose was no doubt stunningly beautiful, but the reason it was deserted is it was a terrible spot for this ceremony. And then also, they didn't have any medical personnel on standby. The ceremony that Anna and her family were taking part in is known as the Russian Orthodox Epiphany, and it's a type of baptism. Basically, people all over Russia at this time of the year will carve a cross-shaped hole in the ice over a body of water, and then one by one, they'll jump into the water and then emerge again, baptized, purified. And so Anna and her family had done that. They had carved the cross in this frozen body of water. But the reason this spot was a terrible spot to do this ceremony and why it was totally deserted is because they had chosen a raging river. That yes, it's frozen, but underneath that river is still flowing and it's a very deep river. And so the second Anna stepped into the water feet first, she got swept away. But they didn't have a way for her to re-emerge. It's all frozen ice. And so the second she went under into the pitch black water, she was gone. And within a couple of seconds, her family is expecting her to come back up again, but of course she didn't. And so they began screaming, and Anna's husband actually leapt into the water, but he actually stopped himself really quickly because he felt that current pulling him. And so he got out, and very quickly, a search was launched for Anna, but there was no hope. They couldn't find her, and in fact, to this day, they still have not recovered her body.